second opinion, a new adventure for both you the viewer and for me as well. For now, you can just call me Sweet Tea. I'll be your host for this evening, so sit down, relax, and have a good time.
To those of you seeing this video while it's still fresh and new, I'd like to say thank you for watching. And to those of you who may find this years, decades, or even centuries after it was originally posted, I've got to ask, how is Final Fantasy XV? Has it finally released, or did it take Duke Nukem Forever's record and use it as a tissue? Our show is one that will be geared toward trying to give video games the fair trial that they deserve. We're on a mission to not only figure out what makes each game tick, what works and what doesn't, and why this is so, but also to try and answer the much more difficult question of why we think a particular game is quote-unquote fun. We will attempt to be as fair as possible to each game, separating the function-based factors from the more malleable ones that mean more or less to each individual who experiences them. On to our first review, which is of a game that many of us have no doubt played countless times throughout the years since its release. This game is the original Mega Man for the NES. Released in North America in December of 1987, Mega Man was the beginning of a long-running series that helped cement Capcom as a force to be reckoned with during the late 80s and early 90s. Ironically enough, it wasn't until years later that the first Mega Man title gained the attention of gaming audiences, many players coming back to it after being blown away by Mega Man 2. The basic premise of the game is simple. Humanity has reached a point where AI-controlled robots are soon to become fairly commonplace. This is largely thanks to a man named Dr. Light and his assistant Dr. Wily. Along with a cleaning robot named Rock, the two gentlemen create 6 other robots in order to handle tasks that might be too dangerous for humans. Through either fairly complex or extremely simple motives depending on what version of the story you look to, Dr. Wily eventually decides to betray Light and reprograms the 6 other robots to do his evil bidding. He runs off with them and attempts to take over the world. Being the only one left, Rock is reprogrammed and rebuilt by Light, as this is the only way Wily can be stopped. When everything is said and done, Rock is no more. He is now and forevermore to be known as Mega Man. Gameplay-wise, this setup is represented by 6 different robot masters that can be faced in any order, which was a pretty unique idea at the time. Most games were very linear in structure back then, but Mega Man allowed you to take on any of the 6 stages in any order you wished. This greatly expanded the replay value, as you could play the games over and over, trying to figure out the optimal route through the game. As Mega Man defeats the Robot Masters, he has the ability to gain new weapons from them. These weapons can help you out during the stages, as they each do drastically different things. But what's more, every one of the weapons is extra strong against a certain Robot Master, meaning experimentation when facing the bosses is also encouraged. So how does this all come together? The first thing an avid Mega Man fan might notice is the fact that Mega Man 1 has a scoring system, which was removed in all subsequent titles. An interesting relic of the time period, the scoring system allowed players to compare skills based on who had the higher point total. I personally would have enjoyed it if the score system would have returned in later games, but the difficulty of the series likely would have made it pointless, since many people would find it far too challenging to get through an entire Mega Man game without using a continue. You see, much like most classic titles with scoring systems, losing all of your lives and using a continue will reset your points to 0 in Mega Man 1. So there's no reason to waste development efforts on a feature that most people won't be able to use effectively, right? Meanwhile, players new to the Mega Man series will quickly catch on to the clever ways the game goes about explaining its mechanics, never once stopping the action to do so. One example would be in a Lek-Man stage. Very early, the player will notice certain platforms with blue lights in them. Every few seconds, said platforms will shoot an arc of lightning from them. However, the first time this happens, the player is safely stationed below where they can't get hurt. These types of player cues are hidden all over within the game, though not all of them are completely thought out or player-friendly. Gutsman's stage, for example, has a hazard right at the beginning, which requires jumping across moving platforms that will collapse at certain areas. These areas are shown to the player through a short piece of the platform track being all but completely severed. The first platform doesn't have any damaged track, meaning you're completely free to survey the subsequent tracks before you put yourself in danger. Now, I personally didn't have much trouble with the dropping platforms at the beginning of Gutsman's stage, but I did notice that the difficulty between the 3 platforms gets exponentially harder. What's more, sometimes the platforms aren't synced correctly, so you might end up with nowhere to jump, leading to needless deaths. I'm also unsure why this platform section even exists, as this challenge is only brought up one more time later in the game. It's a skill that takes time to master, but doesn't really have much use within the rest of the game. This brings up the issue of whether level design is well done or not. Generally, each of the stages seem to be thought out in a way that makes sense, but large difficulty spikes in many stages can hamper the experience. Some other design choices can be questionable as well, like the use of low-hanging ceilings and overhead platforms as a way to make jumps more difficult. Since you no longer have the full jump arc you're used to, it's usually unnecessarily difficult to gauge these jumps. A simple solution would have been to raise the ceiling above so that you have your full jump arc and widen the gaps between the platforms you're jumping to and from. Kind of like most other jumps in the game. Regardless of whether you find the beginning of Gutsman stage easy or difficult, attempting to overcome these platform jumps will cue you in on some aspects of Mega Man's control, one of which is that the world exerts a gravitational force on our robotic hero, causing him to accelerate downward the longer he's in the air. This means that jumps need to be timed fairly precisely because gravity does have an effect on how far you can deftly leap from one floating block to another. Overall control for Mega Man is extremely sharp and crisp, his animations, sound effects, and general feel informing the player no more or no less than what they need in order to succeed. There are only a few small missteps that feel out of balance, one of which is the tiny slide Mega Man exhibits when he stops running. This will lead to you falling to your death more than a few times when trying to do precise platforming. Iceman's stage in particular has an extra slippery floor, which can be frustrating at first, but since the level is designed around this mechanic, it can eventually lead to a more skilled player and more fun. Luckily enough, Mega Man 1 has infinite continues, so you can make as many mistakes as you want to, and the game is short enough that the lack of a backup save or password system is fine. Mega Man 1 is riddled with pixel-perfect jumps though, which can get the better of you quite a few times, but they're rarely over bottomless pits or spikes, so you usually don't have to worry about getting sent back to the beginning of a stage just because you flubbed a particularly gruesome jump. Enemies, meanwhile, are usually just as fair as the platforming segments, providing decent challenge to those attempting to just run past everything. One really would do well to simply take their time and try to learn enemy movements, otherwise the horrendous knockback will no doubt lead to many a retry. Sprite flicker happens quite a bit throughout the game, even on later ports, though it doesn't get in your way 90% of the time. The only real problem it causes is in the fact that you're often left without the ability to see exactly how much life you have left, as the bar tends to partially disappear quite often. Another issue is the size of your hitbox, or perhaps the hitbox of certain platforms, which occasionally don't connect correctly, with the front or rear quarter of Mega Man simply phasing through the platform, again leading to you facing yet another death. As stated earlier, the powers you receive from the Robot Masters can be used at any time. They can often be useful in making challenging segments easier, but their use is rarely required to progress, meaning the player has a lot of agency in how they choose to tackle the game. On the topic of the Robot Masters, they're rather hit or miss in this title. Most of them provide an interesting idea, though not all of them are well executed. Many of them spend their time just jumping around, occasionally throwing things at the player. Meanwhile, some of them, like Fireman, have no easily discernible patterns, leading to a war of attrition rather than an actual battle. And still others seem practically impossible without exploits, like the infamous Yellow Devil. Take note that Mega Man also isn't invincible after he beats a Robot Master, meaning it's very possible for him to defeat the enemy only to then be killed by a stray attack. The game will sometimes throw vertical platforming segments at the player, as in the case of a Lek-Man stage. Due to Mega Man's simple controls, however, these sections are usually a pain, with large punishments for mistakes, often in the form of the player falling quite a ways and being required to redo decent sections of the level. One other small touch is the fact that the screen can scroll back and forth, so that the player always has the chance to back up if need be. This feature wasn't exactly common in those days, and in other games, the lack of reverse scrolling could sometimes lead to players getting stuck between a rock and a hard place. Play Super Mario Bros. 1 to see what I mean. Unfortunately, other times Mega Man can fall into patterns that felt questionable even when the game was new. One example is the requirement of the magnet beam in Wily Stage 1. Although the beam is in clear view in Electman stage, there's no indication in-game that this is a required item. It's extremely easy for a new player to just pass right by this item, and it's quite possible for a veteran to forget to grab the beam unless they do Gutsman before Electman, meaning your only choice is to die off all of your remaining lives and reset your score. In fact, I don't quite agree with the idea that any of the Robot Master power-ups should be required during the Wily stages. It's a great idea in theory because it drives home the fact that Mega Man has grown throughout his struggles, but then you realize your weapon tanks don't refill after death, and don't even refill between stages. This can lead you being stuck grinding the first few enemies in Wily Stage 1 if you end up dying later during the stage and don't have enough Super Arm or Elect Beam ammo to continue through the rocks blocking the base entrance. And this can also mean many battles later on become significantly more difficult if you don't get enough weapon energy drops, which are random by the way. To make matters still worse, weapon energy only refills a weapon if you currently have that weapon selected. Accidentally grab it with the wrong weapon in hand, or worse, with the Mega Buster out, well then you just completely wasted it. To wrap things up in the gameplay department, here are a few more quick things to note. I liked how the boss rush in this game was staggered a bit rather than all at once. It felt less tedious than in later titles. The enemies have some interesting tactics. I especially enjoyed the crazy razy enemies at the beginning of Iceman stage, where shooting them in the head instantly kills them, but shooting their body leads to the head detaching and homing in on you. The footholders in Iceman stage as well as Wily stage 1 can be a bit cheap however, with their hitboxes sometimes damaging you rather than allowing you to hitch a ride, and they occasionally won't reach far enough for you to jump on the next platform, leading to a frustrating loop of you dodging projectiles while you pray that it changes directions. Speaking of Iceman, his block puzzles can be really challenging for new players, and dying later on in the stage can often end up with you needing to complete them multiple times, so watch out for that. Another thing to note is that power-ups can despawn if they go off screen, but so can enemies. This can obviously be either useful or detrimental to your experience. It's also unfortunate that finding the weakness of many of the Robot Masters can make them a cakewalk. I understand that's the point, but it would be nice if they still put up some of the fight. Graphically, the game is about what you'd expect from the NES. The art direction is great, with some interesting ideas adequately realized when you consider the limitations of the system. The color palette is nice and has some great variety. An interesting note is that the Blue Bomber was actually colored blue by default to help him pop in the environments. The animations are nice too. Though simple compared to some other NES titles, the animations served their purpose well, and the small sprites meant that the levels could feel large, complex, and open. Since there isn't too much else to say about graphics beyond that, let's move on to sound design. Yes, that sound is incredibly annoying. There wasn't anything else they could have chosen that was less painful. I felt the music presented some creative and interesting ideas with a diverse array of musical themes. Unfortunately, none of the songs quite compared to those from later games. They definitely have potential, but they could have done with a bit more polish and maybe another audio track dedicated to filling them out. I personally really enjoy the boss intro theme and the stage clear theme though. Meanwhile, many of the sound effects in the game have become iconic, but others were left behind, usually because they were nothing more than par for the course. There's a reason why sounds like Sonic's classic jump and the Final Fantasy menu are still used in some form or another. Most of the Mega Man sound effects that reached the same status were again from later games in the series. Overall, I'd say that Mega Man 1 is definitely a worthy start to the series. It introduced many mechanics to mainstream game design and helped set the bar for how awesome soundtracks and less linear design could have been done at the time. While not even close to being perfect, it's an honorable effort and a game that can still be played today with minimal pain compared to many other games from that era. Most of the flaws in Mega Man can be attributed to either console limitations or just the time period in which it was crafted. Still, some of them are inexcusable, but at least none of them are egregious offenses to the point that they can't be looked past for most players. Back then, things that can be quantified as quote-unquote fun in game design weren't as important as they should have been. Instead, designers usually focused on making a game difficult because they had very limited cartridge space and needed a way to justify the sometimes $70 plus price tag. Mega Man doesn't fall into this trap intentionally, though it stumbles a few times. But depending on your preferences, the game makes up for it with the sheer amount of replayability its design structure presents. It's a game that I personally only had a moderate amount of fun with, but it's well designed enough that it ends up holding up even today. Before you go, however, I have one more thing to say. This is my first time doing a lot of things, from scripting to editing videos. If you have any constructive criticism, I'd greatly appreciate it. I'll be attempting to keep a schedule of one video every 2 weeks, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for taking the time to watch this. See you next time.